So we've gone through Postman, we've talked about Chrome that was in there. Now, one of the other really interesting tools that I think is important for network developers to become comfortable with as you're going through is container technologies. And today, the one you really should start out with is Docker. Docker is a Linux container, or it started out as Linux, though it now fully supports Windows. You can run Windows containers. You can run containers on Windows. There's super support for Windows with Docker now. But understanding how to use it and experiment with it is really important for network engineers, because what a container is it's a way to package up an application in a different way. But every container has to communicate with the outside world and other parts of the application. And the way that communication happens is through network connections. And so Docker and all of the technologies that build on it, things like Kubernetes and these other ones, really, really rely on having a solid network for the containers to function with. And so as network engineers, if we need to build and help design secure and well-performant networks for containers, we have to understand what containers are and how to use them. And a great way to get started is just installing Docker right on your workstation and using it. And so over here, we've got the place you finally downloaded is the Docker store. You can get to it from docker.com and then downloads. But we can see I'm on the Docker Community Edition for Windows. Docker has a Community and Enterprise Edition. The Community Edition is the completely open source. You can install it. You do have to create an account with Docker to download it. But again, it's a free account that goes through. The Enterprise Edition has support and extra tools that are used for corporate or organizations that are trying to do larger deployments of Docker for production applications and need higher capabilities. But the Community Edition is more than enough to get started and learn all about how Docker works. And so you come in, you go get Docker here. Once again, I downloaded this to save some time. And we'll go ahead and I'm going to run this installation, and we can kind of chat a bit about what Docker is while we kill time for the install to finish.
Yeah, we had a whole section talking about Docker, or video about Docker and Kubernetes, so guys can watch that. But if people haven't watched that, can you give us like the 30-second what is Docker?
Yeah, absolutely. So what Docker is it's, as I mentioned, it's a Linux container. I keep saying Linux. It's not just Linux anymore. It's a application container technology. And what that means is normally when we think about running an application, there's lots of ways we've done that. We can run applications by just installing them on our workstation. We've installed Postman. We can run applications by packaging it up inside of a VM. So a lot of organizations now or companies ship their software as OVA files that you would download and install in VMware or Hyper-V or some other virtualization platform. The application containers is another way to package up an app. And the biggest difference between an application container and a virtual machine, because they're often kind of seen as similar, is that a virtual machine is an entire computer system. It has a kernel, it has the operating system, it has all of the drivers to interact with the hardware, it has all of the utilities, Notepad will be on there, if it's a Linux-based VM, it'll have all the Linux tools. It might have Minesweeper or Solitaire. Like a VM, it has everything that's there. An application container is super stripped down to the bare minimum necessary for that application to run. It doesn't have an operating system in it necessarily. It doesn't have hardware drivers in it. It doesn't have any of the unnecessary tools or a graphical user interface. It certainly doesn't have Solitaire installed. It just has the application and then anything that application needs to run. And because it's so skinny down, they're much, much smaller than a virtual machine. You might download a virtual machine for an application and you get a couple of gigabytes or 10 gigabytes or more sometimes. If you get a container, and a container might only be a couple of tens of megabytes or maybe 100 megabytes for the container. It's a much, much smaller footprint as it goes through because it's very... it's built to be very efficient to go through it and be able to run just about anywhere. So that's kind of the quick piece. But as you mentioned, we did do an entire discussion and demo and kind of dive into Docker as well as Kubernetes that was there. So, all right. So my Docker installation finished here. Now, there is a couple of things that you need to have on your Windows machine before you can install Docker. Now, Docker for Windows has been out for several years, and it's gone through different variations. Right now, the way that Docker works is Docker actually installs on your Windows machine and leverages the Hyper-V service that Windows offers even inside of their desktop operating systems. And so a prerequisite to installing Docker is, if I go into Windows Features, I gotta spell it right though, Windows Features. So we've got this turn Windows features on or off. If I look in here, you need to enable the Hyper-V features on yours. Now, my workstation is a Windows 10 desktop. I think it's Windows 10 Enterprise because this is my corporate issued laptop. And so I just need to go ahead and add these. The Hyper-V feature should be in most Windows 10 installations. I think there may be some flavors of like the really student editions or maybe the home flavors may or may not support Hyper-V. But this is one requirement to get Docker for Windows installed is to have Hyper-V set up. If you're on a version that doesn't have Hyper-V or you're on a pre-Windows 10 version, you should still be able to find some of the older installations of Docker for Windows that work differently. But if possible, I definitely recommend moving to the new version. And that's one of the reasons when we talked about the evolution of Windows, the latest versions of Windows have added a lot of really interesting features. And so if possible, it is good to get to this kind of Windows 10 platform from some of these pieces. So our install did finish. Before we go kind of look at it and poke at Windows or Docker a bit, any questions?
No, that's great. It's interesting about the Hyper-V option that you selected there. That's good to know.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's just because under the hood, I mean, frankly, what Docker is doing is it's using Hyper-V to create a small little virtual machine that is doing all of the Docker stuff that's there. So it's running on Windows. I would still say that it's natively on Windows. I didn't have to manually create a VM to do it, but it is a virtualization technology and it's using that Hyper-V capability that's there. All right, so I've installed Docker and then let's see if it's running. It is not currently running. So when you install it, it actually installs an application. So let's start it up. Docker, we can see here in my start menu, I've got Docker for Windows. It's a desktop application. So we'll go ahead and fire this up. Now you can set it to start automatically. I often turn that off for myself because if I'm not using Docker actively, there's no need to have those components running in the background using CPU and memory and extra battery life. So I like to turn stuff off that I'm not using, which is why it wasn't started already.
So Hank, I have got a question. We often hear about Docker, and it's kind of like Docker is containers, but that's not true, is it? I mean, there are perhaps other container technologies. Could you talk a little bit about stuff that's perhaps not Docker related? What other container technologies are there, if any?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, and it's actually it's a good one for network engineers to understand what's going on there. And so I'll say it's the original, but I'm not a super container expert, so there may have been something before it. But the original application container technology is called LXC, and it's Linux containers, and it kind of started in the Linux space. And LXC containers still exist. LXC containers still exist, and honestly, some of the Cisco platforms, our routers and switches, allow you to run LXC containers on your router and switch. You can package up an application inside of a Linux container, and you can run it right on your router or your switch and run applications at the edge. And people do this for all sorts of reasons, for gathering information about network statistics and then crunching some numbers and summarizing them and then uploading them centrally. So for locations that have bandwidth restrictions, that's a common one that goes through. Running troubleshooting tools at the edge of the network. There's some applications that actually can run to do database work and fog computing. So LXC containers is, I would say, is still a very strong container technology that's worth at least being aware of today that's there because you may stumble across it. And then there's another newer container technology called Rocket containers that came and was developed by the CoreOS team. And CoreOS is an open source development shop. They're recently acquired by Red Hat, I think, but I could be wrong on who acquired them. But Rocket is like Docker. It lets you build container images and run containers and go through on that. Very similar to how Docker works. Now, Docker is by and far, though, the kind of the winning container technology that's there. And so what I recommend folks when I talk with folks about what to learn is I would say learn Docker unless you happen to work at a company or have projects that require one of the other ones, and then clearly go learn those. I would say it's probably still a good idea to at least understand Docker's fundamentals because it's so popular that's out there. But as you mentioned, it is not the only container technology.
So that was Docker. And can you just give us the names of the other ones as well?
Yep. LXC containers. And if you just search for LXC container, you can find linuxcontainers.org and it'll walk you through on that one. And then Rocket, and I think they have some weird abbreviations for it, but Rocket Container should get us to it. Yep. CoreOS RKT, that's how they abbreviate it. Rocket is another container technology, RKT. There's probably other ones, but those are the three that I've worked with and kind of seen in the wild and leveraged. I use Docker all the time. I've been very familiar with LXC containers because Cisco supports LXC containers. We also, to kind of round it out, we also support Docker containers on our switches and routers as well. But originally they were LXC containers. The Docker support is something that's kind of come up over the last year or so into some of the platforms. And so LXC containers and Docker, and then Rocket, RKT.
That's great.
Awesome. All right. So we've got, while we were chatting on that, Docker should have started, and so it did. And so Docker, we can go ahead and interact with it. So I'm going to go ahead, as we were working last week, I think I still have it open. Yep, here we go. I've opened up Git Bash. Because as we talked about in our video last time, I highly recommend, though Windows is a great platform and there's tons of stuff and we're going to see it, if you want to be able to more easily grab examples from the internet and go through, working inside of a Bash environment on your Windows machine makes some of these things a bit easier, which is why here I am in Git Bash. So I can run Docker and I just hit enter and I should get some help information. So we can see that I've now got Docker installed and I got all of these commands, and we're going to run a couple of them. But to show that you don't have to use Bash, I'll open up PowerShell, Windows PowerShell. So PowerShell here, let me make the font a little bigger so it's easier to read. Properties, font. There we go. All right, so that's not. Let me get these back where I actually wanted them. There you go. So now I've got PowerShell on this side, and I should be able to just type Docker here and get the same thing. And so we can see I've got Docker installed on my Windows machine, and I can use it in PowerShell or Command or in Git Bash. Either one of them will go through. I tend to default back to Git Bash because that's where the commands often look and operate more similarly to what I'm used to. And so the first thing you might want to do when you want to test out and make sure Docker's working is run a container, run an image from someplace. And so Docker run is the command that you use to start a running container. And so from a terminology perspective, an image is like a base template. A container is a running instance that actually has kind of been doing stuff. And so I can go Docker run BusyBox. BusyBox is a small, very tiny, lightweight Linux style container that can be used for kind of just testing in pieces. So if I just type Docker run BusyBox and hit enter, the first thing it'll do is pull the template, the image for BusyBox down if you don't have it. I've run this before, so I already had it. We'll look at the images that are available in a second, but we can see it ran and it kind of stopped. Well, the way containers work is that a container is designed to start, run, do whatever it was told to do, and then exit. And so I didn't really tell BusyBox to do anything. It just started up. So it did something, but I didn't really get anything out of it. So we'll do it again. We'll do Docker run. So over here, we're going to go ahead and do Docker run -IT for interactive TTY terminal. So I want to be attached to BusyBox and then just say BusyBox. And so now when it runs this, we can see my prompt changed. I'm now inside of the container functioning. And so in here, I can run different commands. I could do an ls, which is really hard to read here in PowerShell, -l. There we go. It's a little easier. So I can run the Linux command. So I'm in my PowerShell window. I've run and I'm attached inside of a container based on this BusyBox image. And I can go ahead and inside of there. And then when I'm done, I can type exit and exit out of the container, and it's gone as far as it goes. Now, a couple other commands for Docker that are interesting to know is Docker PS is for process. And so it says, the idea here is show me any running containers that are currently running. So if I say Docker PS and hit enter, we'll see that I actually have names. I have a couple that are running, surprisingly. Command created. I wouldn't have expected to have some up, but I do have a few that are up there. I can stop those because there's no reason for them to be running. So I can do Docker stop. And we'll say 3B, and what I'm giving it here is the container ID, this very beginning piece. So 3BC, I'm going to stop that container because I don't need it running in the background. And then 0AD, we'll stop that one as well. And so now if I do Docker PS, there we go. So I don't have any running containers, but I've got some that are stopped. And this is one of the things that are interesting about Docker containers. If I put a -A for all, this will show me all of the Docker containers that have been started and stopped, and we can see these all show an exited status. Each one of these containers, I could restart if I wanted to. I could do Docker start, give it the container ID, or give it the name. This command is rolling really badly. Let me see if I can make it bigger. There we go. So we can see each one of these containers has a container ID, and then it also has a container name. So you can, when you do commands, you can either give it the ID or the name that goes through. So if I wanted to remove one of these, let's say I was done with some of these BusyBox ones and I wanted to go ahead and get rid of them. So I can come through here and say Docker RM for remove, and then we can just do 2C, and it'll go ahead and delete that one that's there and go through. Now you can work through the command line, which is how Docker often is used. But when you install Docker for Windows, it actually installs a GUI tool that can be handy to use as well. It's called Kitematic. And so if I open up Kitematic, oh, apparently it's not downloaded automatically. Let's see how long this takes. So we can, we'll let it download it. It's not going to take long. So we'll download Kitematic, which is the GUI interface for Docker for Windows that lets us actually look at the running containers, interact with stuff, get some more information that goes through on that. So while this download is running, because it's one that I missed, any questions, anything we can clarify any better, David?
Yeah, I think that demo was great, Hank, because you showed yourself using PowerShell, and then you jumped straight into like a Linux shell. So you kind of like, if I understand right, you went through like a TTY, which is similar to what we have on a router, like a TTY or VTY, but it's a TTY, and you jumped straight into the Linux container, and you were kind of on the console of the Linux container. Is that right?
Exactly. It'd be like if I SSH'd into a Linux VM. I was just attached to it on that side.
Yeah, so to me, it's like as an analogy for like a network guy, it's kind of like you connected to the console or a aux port or a TTY port is the right term, but like another kind of console port onto that that container, just like you would with a VM connect to say a console on a VirtualBox or on VMware Workstation. Is that kind of like an analogy, and is that true?
I wouldn't even say it's an analogy. That's exactly the same thing. I mean, it's under the hood. That's exactly what's going on. So your description is spot on.
That's great. I mean, it's nice to see you talk about TTYs on Windows and on Docker in the same way like we see on a router. Exactly.
Yeah, because and that's the other one that's important, I think, for us to keep in mind is routers and switches and firewalls. Really, under the hood, they are just computers running software, and in most cases, for years, they've been running Linux and then having the network application running on top of it. So.
Yeah, it's nice to see, like, if I had a console onto a router, I was in Windows, and then I jumped straight into the console of the router. Here you were on Windows, and you jumped straight into the console of Linux. It's nice to see that.
Yeah, yep. And honestly, on some of the platforms today, you can actually get access to the Linux bash environment outside of the network software. right away. So you can actually get in under the hood and go through. It's one of the things that's kind of interesting that I've thought has been really interesting in these last couple of years is as network vendors, Cisco and all of them, I would say at this point, are opening up a little bit more access to the stuff that's going on under the hood. All right. So my download for Kitematic finished. I've extracted the zip file, and we'll go ahead and we'll run Kitematic here and see if it goes through and lets us jump into what I was after. All right. So here it's running Kitematic. We can see I can connect to Docker Hub. So to download Docker, you had to create a Docker account. So I've got mine. I'll log in. What this does, this enables us within the GUI interface now to actually download or push containers up and share containers that are through and browse the hub that's there. But what I wanted to show is here on the side, this actually shows all of the containers that are there. And if I were to drag this over to the side, and we'll bring PowerShell back up just to show that it's the same list. I should be able to do it this way. Let's go find it again. There we go. So we can see Admiring Bell is one of the containers, and we can see Admiring Bell. And so when you're working with Docker, most folks always think it's this Linux and it's command line all over the place, and it can be, and oftentimes you'll get there. But you can even get started with the here. So if I wanted to get rid of some of these, so if I didn't want these, I can hit these little X's. It'll let me remove these containers. And so I can work with Docker for Windows through this GUI. I've got all sorts of different access. There's a link here to open up the Docker CLI. There's information for some of the settings that are running under the hood. And so this Kitematic application is actually a really handy one to install in addition to just the Docker for Windows. And as we saw, it's just an extra download and you just start it right up.
It's really nice, that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we're past our normal time, kind of going off of